Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Alec Stanners of bVoIP. Alec, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Chris. Appreciate you asking me to come on.
So this is a little bit topic today for anybody wondering, since we did say VoIP in the name of where Alec works, that would mean that it's probably going to be about phones. It has come up a few times over the last few months where I've had some conversations with MSPs, particularly MSPs going through the trust mark, who have raised concerns around how they're doing some of the physical layer security with regards to their phone systems. And so they would do, physically phones are plugged into a separate switch and all that. And we know that in today's world, that's becoming less and less common just because we're not rolling out physical infrastructure to support, physical layer segmentation for things like VoIP from computers, etc. But we are seeing a lot of VLANing where VoIP's been put on one channel and our channel. I'm gonna put that on channel 3. Hold on a second. Let me just turn the knob. Uh, but what was interesting about the conversation that I had recently was the MSP was like, we are totally hands off the voice services. We've put them on a separate VLAN. We've partnered with a VoIP provider, and they handle all the support for the phones and really hands off. And it made me think back to going back 2001, like a couple of years ago, when VoIP was just kind of coming on the scene. In a lot of cases, you were doing VoIP was more of the GUI and what was happening in the cloud, and then you'd have some sort of SIP trunk T1, whatever it was, that was bringing you the services to the building, and then you had some sort of digital on-prem system, and as long as it met certain requirements, you were good to go. But back then, knowing how to support and manage phone systems was very different from what it is today in the way we interact with it. I mean, like today is more common to actually plug your computer into the back of your phone. Your phone is a switch, all those things that you maybe don't even want the end user to do. And so as you and I were talking as you came onto the show about some of your experiences, the precedent is, well, if I'm hands off or even hands on, what are some of the responsibility or obligations an MSP might have supporting VoIP or being hands off with VoIP? What are some of the security concerns that you're seeing, and what are partners doing about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's zoom back real quick and talk about the kind of landscape as it sits for MSPs, because I
Sure.
think it's funny because I think a lot of the markets have matured, and as much as VoIP's been around for a long time, and you would have expected that maturity to come,
Right.
it hasn't necessarily in a lot of ways. So when you look at a lot of the markets, they push towards things like MFA and single sign-on, just basic stuff, right? The kind of one-on-ones of security of today. And I think in the MSP space, I guess in the space in general, there's a million options out there for VoIP. And I think that starts the problem because when there's a lot of things to manage, they don't always get regulated perfectly. So we run into scenarios where people are on really old infrastructure, like depending on where you are in the country or the world. Infrastructure can be drastically different than, if I'm in a major metro with, very updated infrastructure, or I'm using, obviously there's a couple different pieces of every single phone system that an MSP is going to manage. There's the physical hardware, there's the software that's running it, and then there's the dial tone SIP trunk portion of it.
Sure.
Dial tone SIP trunk could be a really good high-end provider. We work with a company called BCM1. They're a major provider out of New York. They acquired about 7 or 8 different companies and rolled them all to become this super provider, and they're very heavy on security. I've also run into MSPs that are utilizing a VoIP service. They're like, hey, I got way better tax coverage, and
Yeah.
taxes are way less. And I'm like, okay, let me take a look at this. Well, have you seen what their operation looks like? I mean, they're running this thing out of a garage.
Right.
So
And it's not just any garage, it's the shed that you buy at Home Depot that's in the backyard that
yeah,
has
the big
door big enough to
Rubbermaid.
park a car. Yeah, it's a Rubbermaid. Exactly.
Exactly. So like that's kind of the the range of what we're dealing with out there. So that's the first thing is understand the infrastructure of what you're buying into. Where's this set up? What is the security and compliance that's on the data side of everything, right? I think that's a major portion that MSPs really need to think about because we've seen the good, the bad, and definitely the ugly. As we move on from that, I think there's become some best practices, or we're starting to see some best practices made, which is great. Um, MFA is starting to be pushed a little bit more, but I mean, that felt like a practice that should have taken place 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Well, and you're talking about in the context of phones, but I mean, like, we really didn't see and still haven't seen that across switches or a lot of your
Yeah.
on-prem infrastructure, whether it's firewalls or access points, adding in things like, oh, maybe authenticating to this asset for management requires something more than, oh, no, we have a management port that you have to plug into, and you would never keep that on the network.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's Wild West, unfortunately. That
But
was one of the,
in fairness, when we think about, going back to the beginning, you described a lot of the different things that have happened over the years, the new technologies. But one thing that's always been true this whole time is analog lines aren't gone. They're still here. Faxing is still a thing. Even if it's not analog anymore, it's some sort of digital fax in theory.
yeah,
But along those lines, we wouldn't necessarily expect those technologies to change. And yet things wear out, right? So I was thinking about, like, if anytime you were describing all these different technologies, but don't forget the deterioration of physical infrastructure, right? Like Cat 5
mhm.
cable, Cat 5e cables was largely the early standard of what everybody went to in the early, that's what you used, right? If it was data cable, it
Oh
was
yeah,
Cat 5 or Cat 5e, which was really what was expected if you were doing VoIP. But those cables installed in 2001, 2005, even 2010. And then the other piece that you have is the fact that when the HIPAA law was passed, it was all about privacy. They added the security rule in 2013. So what was traditional, like I have a traditional analog phone system and you leave a voicemail, fine, that's covered under the privacy rule and I don't care about it. But as soon as that phone switched from it being an analog message to a digital message, oh boy, now it's data.
all bets are off. Yeah,
All bets are
it's in
off.
the cloud. And that's the thing. Like we definitely still see copper out there, plenty. And you touched on another one there, fax.
Mhm.
Fax seems to have slid in some ways to be very industry specific now. Like
Yeah,
medical's never
largely
letting go.
healthcare
Yep. Legal loves it.
and maybe
So
finance if you're dealing with like loan processing. They like to have their, dot matrix printer with the three layers of
oh,
paper. Love it.
yes,
Go
they
rent a
absolutely
car.
love it. Which it blows my mind because you have, just sidetrack for a second, but you have that as the standard. And then, you buy a Tesla and you can set up and do everything from your phone and initial three pieces of paper and drive away with the car.
Right.
So what is the gap there?
And who has the paper copy? Like, right? Like you think about it, like whose filing cabinet did this go into? Or was it scanned? I mean, DocuSign, at CompTIA, we largely use DocuSign for everything.
Yep.
If we could get more in, oh wait, I'm not spending any money on another service. I'd rather have my dot matrix printer that only three people in the world can service.
Exactly. Well, and that's where it gets weird, right? I think we all kind of said, oh, fax, that'll go away. And we all just figured it would kind of die this slow death and flame out, and it hasn't. So we
Right.
haven't updated it, and we've just expected it to die, and it hasn't.
I think it's because of
So
that Hank Williams Jr. song "Fax Me a Beer." I think people are still trying to perfect that.
that's what it is.
Yeah,
That was the turning
absolutely.
point of fax.
That's right. They're like, it's gonna die, and then the song came out, and there's no way this will ever die. Now, I mean, we're all imagining one day it'll just show up on a fax machine that's never had a fax sent to it. All of a sudden, it's gonna materialize. You're like, that's what I've been waiting for. That's why I kept it plugged in.
That's a 3D printer we're all waiting for.
That's right. Right.
I think it's funny because that I think is one of the major things we're watching and we're seeing as a security concern for sure. Are those two areas, and just that kind of standoff of who's going to budge first, right? Are the systems going to say, okay, we're going to stop offering fax? Are we going to, really just push the infrastructure? Because if you look at like Australia, for instance, is a great example. They went out and they said, we're going to lay the entire country in 5G. First, we're going to try Tasmania. If Tasmania works out, they're our test bed. Then we're going to roll it out in all the states. We're going to put out a bid. We're going to let all the major companies bid on it, and they can come in. We're going to set up a government funded project. We're going to completely cover the entire country in 5G. And I mean, they're doing it. And so you look at where we are on our side. Is somebody eventually going to say, hey, we're going to rip all the copper lines out? Are they going to say, hey, we're done with fax? Or are we going to accept that fax will probably be around longer than we all thought it would be? And that may not be going anywhere soon. We're going to, update pieces a little bit and make sure there aren't any holes there. I mean, it's a very aging technology at this point.
Fair. I think though that, whether it goes away or not, the challenges I think that you see, I mean, you and I talked about this earlier about when George was running his MSP, the challenges there, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But I mean, a lot of that technology was built way before any of the features that were baked into that technology were ever taken advantage of. So, like I had back in the day, conference room phones were almost exclusively made by Polycom, and we had
Yeah.
a Cisco branded, but it was obviously a poly. I mean, even the model number said right on there, there was a Polycom conference phone. And in my office, we had the extension mics, like, for, offices that have the conference room, that's the table, the one table that seats like 60 people around it. So we
Yep.
had the little microphone extenders on each of our desks. And then that SIP unit sat in the middle. And so we had to use we had a asterisk box, essentially a Raspberry Pi that converted SIP
Yeah.
to VoIP, and then it connected into our VoIP system. But like we used that for probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. That was our conference phone. And so you translate that and all those technologies that are still largely in use in some capacity across different ecosystems of VoIP services or phone services. But then I also think about the things like, uh, you know, what is the obsolescence that's happening inside the VoIP services space? So like why do I have, now 100 different SIP or PRI type providers? And they're all offering, services at, 0. You can no longer do the math on how cheap your cost per call is. But then you're like, but wait a second. On my cell phone, I just pay flat unlimited fee. How are we still in the world of like I might as well have a calling card for my local outbound calling.
No, so I think that we are definitely seeing more of a shift. We've seen a shift in both ways. bVoIP chose to kind of take a more agnostic approach in terms of how we're going to focus on the plans. I think the whole industry shifted to per user per month. A lot of them will push an unlimited now, but it's a hefty cost. That moved away from the older setup that you're used to, right? Which was I can do a simultaneous call into the building
Yep,
and I can decide how many open lines I need. And I think that was hard for the MSPs because I think that took away a lot of the old margin that you used to get. Because like you said, you
sure.
used to make tons of money back in the day on your MSP. And we actually offer both, which is cool. We're able to let MSPs really decide what fits best for, the individual environment they're in. But yeah, I mean, I think when we look
Emergency
at
services often factor into that. If you need emergency
yes,
service,
they
so
do.
you have two extremes, right? You have all of the players like Zoom, Teams, multi-conference platform type stuff that have
Yep.
added in, you know, DIDs directly to the user, regardless of where they are. And then you still have this necessity for physical handsets in places like hospitals, clinics or whatever, fire departments, even like elevators still have the
Mhm.
ability to make some sort of call that's either analog or if you get a up and coming, young whippersnapper that's like, hey, we're gonna put phone lines into your elevator, but we're not doing analog. That's ridiculous. Why would we do analog? I don't need any more false calls happening because someone bumped, the
Yep.
the wall and crossed the copper, and all of a sudden it's making dial tone and calling somebody.
100%. Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing more push to less points of failure on site, which I like. So like you talked about that Raspberry Pi box and stuff like that. Like we're definitely seeing a shift away from that to really kind of simplify it as much as possible on site, which I love from a technology standpoint, right? We're creating less points of failure, less things to manage, less essentially endpoints that we're having to monitor and deal with. And I think as we move down the road, we're going to continue to see that. I think, if I look at our basic setup right now, it's pretty simple, right? We're doing hand sites on the actual physical site. SBCs are at the data center. So that's all been moved off site. It's at the data center level now. So like just a lot easier, lot less
Redundancy is
management.
taken off the plate of the MSP largely.
Exactly. Yeah. Which I love. I don't think it should be on their plate. I think it's on the provider's plate for sure. So it's good to see that. Where there's still some setups that will have the SBCs on site for sure. But I think I look at the headaches, you touched on earlier that George went through with his MSP from multiple different standpoints, whether it was
Sure.
just a redundancy standpoint. There used to be all the proprietary hardware, and that was a bit of a nightmare. We moved away from that. Polycom, as you said, came in, took over the industry. They split. A couple of the engineers left, created Yealink. That's been
Yeah.
a pretty fast up and coming one. We actually see more Yealink now than Poly, which is
Well, and
kind of
they
grinds me dead.
basically brought a phone to market that was like 1/5 of the cost with a color screen and a bajillion features that no one knew what they were supposed to use them for. And Polycom's like, yeah, but I have a module you can buy and it gives you a camera functionality for Teams. And you're like, on my phone? Like I'm gonna now stare at my phone. Like who else has a
Yeah,
phone in their office that they're like, hold on, I'm not gonna use the camera on my computer because I have one that plugs into my phone. How about that?
yeah. I'm sure it's great quality.
Yeah, and like if I was gonna do that, why not just use Teams on my smartphone? Like this seems like way overkill to be, oh no, I don't have a smartphone. I just have my flip phone.
Yeah,
But it also
seriously.
has a camera. Oh, it's a never-ending cycle.
Yeah, I mean it really is interesting to watch. The hardware race has definitely taken off from we saw a huge pop about 5, 10 years ago of innovation in it. It slowed a little bit, right? There was that weird time in the 2000s where everything had to be smaller and smaller, and now it's kind of gotten
Sure.
bigger and bigger. Screens are bigger, a lot more color screens, and then newest innovation thing that I just thought was cool. So any medical focused MSPs that are listening, Snome now makes a handset that is actually completely dipped in a coating that kills all germs. So great for like hospitals, doctors'
Yeah.
offices, things like that. I thought that was very cool, and it's that kind of handset you can carry around. So I know a bunch of our partners have been loving putting those into different medical offices.
Yeah, that's like their M80, M90.
Yep, exactly.
It's funny you bring that up. The other side of that was, and I think it wasn't all works. There was another phone brand that was very proprietary. They had their own switches and everything, and they came out with the phone dock. So like you brought your iPad or a smartphone and you would dock it, and that would give you all of the handset functionality plus the VoIP on that box. So like you would get so like there was no dialing options if you just came up to the handset, but someone could call it so you could answer it, or you would dock your iPad or iPhone or whatever it was, and then that would give you all of the feature sets of that, $400 color screen phone and a $400, dysfunctional has no features unless you bring $1,000 device and plug into it.
Typical, yeah.
It's secure, right? Like you couldn't log into voicemail from that handset without the
That's
iPhone
fair.
or whatever. So shifting gears, obviously this is a security focused
Yes,
show. We've talked a lot about the technology, which I think is important to put some backstory to this because it's easy to take for granted that which is VoIP services or phone services in any environment. Who's responsible for it. I think this is the just to touch on for a minute. One of the first areas that can be very dangerous for an MSP is coming into an environment that they're feasibly taking over the management of assets, and they don't even consider the phones as part of the assets that are now part of the ecosystem that they're going to be responsible for.
100%. Yeah, no, I think that it's a major one, and the reason I always like to touch on that portion of it when we kind of talk about this is it still is such a wide range of technology out there with legacy hardware, legacy setups. So I would highly suggest you definitely always keep that as a serious potential area of threat. right? Understand
Yeah,
it, understand what's coming through it, understand who the provider is, who the SIP provider is, how's everything managed, how's everything saved, um, and understand the compliance around all of that, just so there's no surprises for you down the road. Um, use that through any kind of you know fact finding mission to find your next solution. Understand that you're getting into something that's not going to create a headache for you down the road. But as we move forward, right, talking about some of the areas where VoIP has been a concern, I think one of the major ones that we've seen, you don't have to go too far back in history, is the MGM casino, right? VoIP spoofing has become pretty common and pretty
sure.
standard.
You
So
see that
user
on cell phones
verification.
too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. How many times you get a phone call in that's from the local number and you're like, oh, let me see who this is.
Or your boss that's not your boss.
Yes.
The text
I've had,
message.
oh, yes. Yeah. So we've had that. I've actually had a call that came in that was from a number that I had saved. It was from an old friend from high school. And I was like, why are they calling me? And I picked it up and it just happened to be that was the randomly generated phone number that they called me from.
Oh
So I matched
wow.
up my phone book. But yeah, I've definitely seen the cell phone one of the text in, the boss is giving a presentation and needs gift
Yep.
cards. We've absolutely seen that one, and it's just it's crazy the amount of we talked about Wild West before, but I think this is another area that's very much in that category. I know Verizon's now working with a pretty cool provider that's they were one of the original self credit card processors. It's a family that owned the company. They've now invested into about 43 different companies. They're like, extremely wealthy and investing heavily in technology, which is awesome. They are working with Verizon actually to launch a product that's going to verify every phone number and make sure it's actually the phone number that it says it's dialing from.
Kind of like
So
DKIM is
Verizon will
for email.
exactly. So it's gonna be able to flash up and say, not verified or not real or verified. Um, so you'll know if it's actually that person calling you or not, which I think is terrific, and I hope to see that launch for all the providers. Um, obviously on the rest of it, user verification can also be controlled by the MSPs today. It's
Okay.
something I'd really suggest. We've seen that as best practice in a lot of our larger MSPs or more security focused MSPs is when somebody's dialing in, verifying who is dialing in.
So to some extent, it's it's ironic that we're talking about this. We're not talking about right now the flaws in the equipment itself per se. We're talking about the way in which people can be exploited because of the ways in which we can use the technology for, say, you know, illicit gain, right? But there
Exactly.
was also like I want to say this was like 2022. Mitel had the big like business network compromise because you could get in through the Mitel phone system and then circumvent through the switching layer and literally
Yeah.
attack the corporate network. And obviously, more importantly, you could take advantage of all of the backdoors into the Mitel system. That was like I think they patched it like their latest release had patched that flaw before the exploit was actually released into the wild that here's the thing, and like but so many people failed to patch it. So before we get too far into all of the things that we
Yeah.
can do, talk to me a little bit about and maybe you don't know the answer to this, but what does it look like to maintain phones or a VoIP system? Because I think that's one of the areas that maybe less responsibility is on MSPs anymore, and more of that responsibility is on making sure that the who you're using as your VoIP provider is that they're doing regular updates to the firmware on the device, they're doing regular software updates to the applications, and they're keeping you aware of known vulnerabilities, kind of thing.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's on a couple layers, right? So a lot of providers out there are utilizing another provider. So for instance, AT&T forever, the business phone that they would offer you was really Ring Central.
Yeah,
Or there's a lot of, there's many providers who are built um, off of Asterisk or other systems that are like
yeah, or
that.
3CX or one of yeah.
Exactly. So I think there's a couple things that are in place, right? Are they updating you along with what the, host product is updating, right? Are they following their update schedule? Are they checking their update schedule? Are they making
Sure.
sure that there's nothing funky in that before they push the update?
Well, there's a
You
lot of
know,
open source or white labeling happening in the space. So a lot of white labeling.
yeah,
And then
tons of
on
it.
the open source side, with Asterisk and some of those other platforms being used, who's maintaining that underlying
Yeah.
infrastructure?
Is it Larry who built it 20 years ago
Right.
and he still works on Thursdays?
Yes. We
But
haven't
yeah, I think
released the new long-term update to Linux for this kernel because, well, Larry's not coming in until next month. He's on sabbatical.
he's down in Florida for the winter, but
Yeah.
when he gets back, we're gonna
He
take a look
doesn't
at
have
it.
internet down there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an area of concern. I would say that should be part of your fact finding when you're really deciding on a provider, right? Are they following a good update? Are they making sure? I agree with you. I think a lot of it has moved off the MSP, which is awesome, and that's really where it should be, right? The MSP do not need another thing to worry about. Um, they have more than enough. I think that there's a little bit of the push. MSPs, we find one of three ways. It's either I tried VoIP in the 90s or 2000s, it blew up in my face. I never want to touch it again. I'm doing it, but I just refer it down the road and I never think about it.
Right.
Um, which, in general, it's a local provider, or you get, yeah, I have a big box provider that either I lightly manage or I pass all support off to them.
Sure.
Um, I think all have different risks to them. I think that one of them is if you're just passing it all off down the road, you don't know what they're updating. You don't know about what
Sure.
compliance they have, right? I mean, I would hope that you're going through that discussion with them and you're regularly going through that because obviously compliance changes. If you haven't had that discussion with your provider in a little bit, have it. Um, I think when you push everything off support wise to another vendor, you don't know how they're supporting it. You don't know what they're going to tell them to do. You could be walking to a very scary. You talked earlier. Are they plugged into the port that's going to allow somebody
Right.
to get in? They might be after that call with AT&T, but those are the things that I would always say. Be careful. Um, and finally, I think if you haven't tried it in a while, it has changed a lot. The technology is vastly different, like everything else, right? Our cell phones in the 90s, 2000s were drastically different than what they are today. Office phones are the same, but everything has also gotten more complex in terms of the threats out there too.
Sure.
So just be aware.
So just thinking through this as we kind of recap, if I was thinking about adding or changing or even understanding what I have today, because we could
Mhm.
argue probably that for the most part, the feature sets at the underlying level are the same, right?
For the most
Heaven
part, yeah.
forbid it does at least have good call quality and you can make and receive calls. If we've established that's going to be on all of them, then you get
Yeah.
into like how many people can you join to one call if it's actually an
Mhm.
actual call as opposed to like, more of a conference platform.
Bridge.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. And then you get into so like assuming all that, now you're getting into where the security parts really come into play is, who's responsible for what. So do we require any sort of handset or physical asset to be stored on at the user's desk, if you will? But then some of the pieces that we've talked about that I think are really important is what are the responsibilities that an MSP really should take, say, the bull by the horns and be vocal with their client? Yeah, it's fine if you're not, are having to deal with like, hey, we're getting, static on our calls and you're handing that off. Fine, but what is that a symptom of? Like, is there something else that's been, plugged into the network that's causing noise? That's, any number of things, right? But like what are
Great
say that
question.
I think there's probably like five things, and we've touched on at least two of them that they need to
Mhm.
be consciously and actively participating in with their clients as it pertains to voice services.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we always suggest is, first of all, when we're doing setup, we always go through permissions, right? Who in your business, in your MSP needs access to what, right? I think that's a major thing that you need to understand, set up, and you also need to discuss with your clients. Um,
How many
so who can
administrators do
access
you
those
want for auto
voicemails?
attendant?
Who can access the voicemails? It's probably one of the major ones I hear constantly, right? Especially depending on the type of business that we're dealing with. We have MSPs that are dealing with hedge funds, medical
Sure.
offices, insurance offices, 911 centers. So all of that, right? That's a major one that we see, and can be, just it's a very uncomfortable conversation from a compliance standpoint. So
Yeah.
that's something that I highly suggest you understand. And then upstream, right, on your provider side, who can access it there? Who has access to those voicemails on their end? And I think the other one is going to be obviously how does this behave with the firewall or switches that we've standardized on? Understand all of that, and then
Your
I
QoS
think the other
rules, if you will, like does the hardware you're
exactly,
using actually support true, you know, traffic prioritization without it having
yep,
to be like you're manually writing rules saying, hey, prioritize this above this. You should be able to say, hey, enable QoS. It's going to know that it wants voice to be prioritized over other data traffic. And you're like, ah, but this is Sonic Wall. No, this is, and it doesn't support that particular obscure protocol being used by your, amazing web provider that's using a port that, security through obscurity.
yeah,
Yeah, they'll never
yeah.
know. They'll never know.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the nice thing for us, being a provider that came from an MSP, right? Was we quickly, obviously, self-servingly, we first built our first one on. We were a Sonic Wall MSP, so we first built a template around Sonic Wall and making
Sure.
sure that everything behaved really well. And how do we optimize it? We worked with the Sonic Wall team for that, and since then we've built it out for many of the other firewall providers out there. I would ask that question, right? Go through the hardware, have a hardware list, understand that um, and then if you aren't standardizing with your clients, like really make sure that that's part of the discovery there. Is that going to work here? Is it going to work well, or is it going to create
Sure.
more headaches for you before you roll it out? Most providers will be pretty good with you. Most providers will give you a test environment to test
Yeah.
it in, you can segment it out. I would suggest running those tests. Pop over there after hours, just do a quick run through on a Saturday or something like that. Make sure it all sounds good, runs well, before you roll anything out, because
Yeah.
people are not afraid to complain when QoS is not good,
So I've gone through
especially
a
on phones.
few of these over the years, right? I probably I would say in the course of my MSP, I think we probably did, I don't know, 30 or 40 VoIP solutions for different that ranged in upfront costs of like no upfront cost to 125 plus $1,000 upfront cost. Uh,
Yep.
what I'm reminded of though is the things that an incoming MSP might not consider is who has LOA, the authorization to essentially pick up the phone still, call the provider and say, I want to cancel these 10 DIDs. I want to add these services. You often see this as a really common occurrence when you're dealing just with the service provider that's feeding the actual calls themselves. So whether it's
Mhm.
the cell phone provider that also handles your SIP trunks, so Verizon or your AT&T, but then there's also all of those Twilio and of course the MSP, if they're doing any of the solution or the VoIP provider is only handling the on-prem VoIP services, they're not handling the trunking to the facility. Oh boy, you could end up with you don't have it. And I had a strange one. I haven't been an MSP now for the better part of 8 years. I think it's been 8 years since I sold.
Yep.
Um, and I had one that I was an employee of the company. I left that company in 2009. I got a call since I've been at CompTIA saying, hey, you're okay if we remove you from being the authorized person on this solution. And I'm like, so just thinking about that, the liability that was still on me because I was still on the list of I could call and say, I'd like to add 3 handsets, please, and you can send them to this address.
I mean, that's a whole other discussion of,
It is, but I think it's one of those
we're-
that I just kind of wanted to reiterate a little bit the space that we're in where we take too many of the pieces for granted. So coming in as the MSP and seeing a phone on a desk, how many MSPs are looking at that going, that's something that I need to take responsibility for at some level because I'm incurring liability as soon as we ink providing them with managed services.
and we always talk about it as, phones are no different than the electricity or the internet that's pumping into the building, right? It's an essential service. Everyone's going to have it.
And data
You
flows
can
through it.
either, yep. and you can either be a part of it, and then you can control the security of it and the management of it, and make some extra money on it, which is great. Obviously, I want margin, but the other end is you can just wait for, you can cross your fingers and hope nothing ever blows up. But the reality is when something has a blinking light on and electricity pumping into it, you're going to get that phone call when something's not working, whether it's under your
Exactly.
management or not. So you may as well do
I
it.
think that's the important piece, right? Like setting up T's and C's to have everybody understand that there is some responsibility there. Like it is an asset that plugs into the network. Like
Mhm.
if it's not getting dial tone like it should because it has a bad data cable, like those are things that are
Yeah.
going to end up on your plate anyways. Uh,
Yeah. And I think when you don't manage it, right, they're gonna, let's say you have a perfect client who isn't gonna call you when the phone stops working well.
right.
They're gonna call whoever, big box provider here. That big box provider, first thing that they're probably gonna say is, oh, it's a network issue. You should call the person who manages your
Abs
network.
Well,
As
I
a
mean,
big
come
first
on.
response.
Yeah, but that's the whole VoIP space, right? Phone
Yeah.
services in general, when it got put on the network, no matter what we did, no matter how perfect it was, the blame game immediately, yes, the point that
Yeah.
you
The
can't be
scarecrow.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we tested this. We tested it like multiple times. You tested it? Well, we plugged it in and turned it on, and it worked when we set it up, and no one was in the office, so it can't be a network problem.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Who's
an
streaming what
ISP.
services?
Exactly. An ISP never gets more excited on a support call to hear that you're using not their router.
Oh, right.
Like that is their favorite point of the sport call because then they can just say, "Not a problem. Good
Yeah.
luck."
Yep.
Off our equipment, not a problem.
Yeah, that's often
Um,
why when they say here's the $5 or $15 monthly rental fee for their router, what you're actually saying is for $15 a month, I can at least blame them when something goes wrong and the router is in the
that's exactly
equation.
it. Yep.
Any last tips on security for VoIP solutions, and then if you would tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, I think the biggest ones, I'll just kind of recap a couple of pieces we talked about, right? First one I'm going to hit on is one we just did, which is include VoIP in all of your offboarding for your employees. So everything from, their CRM access to their, PSA access to RMM, all of your other tools, but make sure that VoIP is in that list. If there's any kind of authority, anything like that, needs to be removed. Alert your upstream providers that that person is no longer with you. If they had any sort of admin access into those tools from a phone standpoint, call-in standpoint, et cetera. So that's a first and big one. Next up is verify, verify, verify. It's not uncommon for people to call in that should not be calling in. A, it's a waste of time for your techs. B, it's a huge liability standpoint. MGM learned that the hard way when somebody asked for a password reset, wasn't verified, and just went on their merry way into the system, shut the casino down for 2 weeks, and
Right.
caused nothing but havoc and dollars. So that's an easy one. There's a lot of great tools out there to do it. Highly suggest you make that part of your process. Next one is going to be understand the providers that you're working with, the providers you might work with, and the providers that your customers are working with. Because there's a lot of areas, we hit on at the end here, but it is a piece of the network. It's on the network. It's always going to live on the network. There's nothing you can do about it. So you've got to find a good way to make sure that it's not a hole or something that's going to cause an issue for you down the road.
Sure.
You can do that really simply by understanding, and we have MSPs all the time who call us and they say we need to understand from a compliance standpoint where you sit. Um, we have all those documents ready to go. If your provider doesn't, that's a red flag.
Sure.
So definitely make sure that's part of your discovery process. And last but not least, it is a service that no matter what, they will be calling you on. So it's better to manage it up front and make sure that you've at least got the control where when something does go wrong or something does happen, you've got that LOA to call in and make something happen with the provider and get your client back in a good spot. So at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? Make sure the clients are up and running and having a good time, and then
Yeah, security is
they're happy with
pointless
you
if you can't use the service.
for sure.
And
So
where can listeners find you?
yeah, easiest way is probably going to be LinkedIn. You can feel free to email me, astanners at bvoip.com, or head over to bvoip.com to find out more about us. You can find me right through there as well.
All right, sounds good. For those of you listening, this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks and have a great week.